Hello, I'm Pete Ramey. My wife Ivy and I run a farrier business in Northeast Georgia, geared mostly at the rehabilitation of hoof problems. And in our spare time, when we're not doing anything, we also teach weekend clinics all over the country and abroad to horse owners and farriers, and also to veterinarians for continuing education credit. We've built a website, or Ivy built a website, and I contribute to it, but built a website, www.hoofrehab.com, and it's filled with hundreds of pictures, case studies, articles, and that's the best way. If you're watching this video, we filmed it any time between 6 months ago or 20 years ago, and we're constantly learning. So going to the website is going to be the best way to stay current on what we're up to. As we've traveled around teaching clinics, the most common criticism that we've gotten is that we're trying to pack too much information into too short of a time period, and that people can't digest it all. And the people have begged us to film this thing. So here we are. We're going to try to get some of it down on tape so you can watch it at your leisure. And in doing this, what's always worried me about clinics, and maybe more so with filming the DVD, is that somebody is going to take a little piece of information and run off half-cocked and trim their horses and do harm. So I've got to say that there's not a cookie-cutter method. There's not any one thing that I can say, cut this off a horse and leave that on there and add to this, and because no methodology will work on every single case. If I have a method at all, it's not to continue doing something that's not working. So I'll start off doing one thing, and if the hooves aren't responding well, I'll switch over to something else, and constantly trying to make sure every hoof in my care is the best that it can be. And that takes experience. Now, the more you study, the more you learn. That's a shortcut to experience, picking up insight. But the really right way that I hope that people will do this is to find a professional in your area to help you get started. I'm completely supportive of horse owners trimming their own horses, but the right way to do it is to find somebody that knows what they're doing and let them help you start. Now, the way I do it in my clientele, if I have a client that wants to trim their own horses, then that's great. I start working out the bugs and trimming the feet. I'm teaching them things along, and they can do trimming in between my visits. And so when I show up and there's nothing for me to do, then I start stretching my visits out to longer periods. So then the horse owner can wean themselves off of me when they're ready and when the horse is ready. And in my opinion, that's the right way to do that. Well, it's hard to find a good professional. I've seen 40-year veterans that were absolutely wounding the horse at every trim. But then I've seen horse owners that just cut off what they seem to be excessive that were actually doing a good job. And I've seen everything in between. So it's really tough to know if you've got the right help. And for that reason, we've tried to fill that void where we've helped to form the American Hoof Association. And what it is, it's not a training program, but it's a peer review. It's made up of working professionals in the field that evaluate each other's work, both in the beginning and continually. So the people on the list, the people in the association, didn't just pay a fee to get in. They had to be approved, and their work was approved by a panel of professionals. So it gives the horse owner some assurances that they have somebody that knows what they're doing. You can find them at www.americanhoofassociation.org. Okay, to the professionals that are watching this. I don't expect for you to watch this DVD and change everything that you do, switch completely over to everything that I say and do. I wouldn't respect you if you did. I study I study everybody's work that I can get my hands on. You know, we go to clinics and to other people's clinics and watch and learn. And I'm so happy if I can pick up a shred of information or a new insight from somebody else that helps me help a horse. And that's the way I hope you'll look at this look at this DVD. Is okay, buddy, tell me something that'll help me out there somewhere. That's what I'm after, not to change everything that you're doing, but hopefully to add a tool or two to your bag of tricks. And I don't want to be your guru. I'm not qualified. Admittedly, I went through a guru period for a while. It was long about 98, 99. It was when I first switched my business from metal horseshoes to trimming and booting. And like most people that do that, it made me an immediate founder junkie. And when I fixed all the foundered horses around I could get my hands on, then I started going to the killer market and buying foundered horses, and I saw great success right from the beginning. And so yeah, I went through this period that I thought I can fix anything. Just as fast as I can grow a new foot from the hairline to the ground, you bring it and I'll make it right. Then I put my first horse down that I couldn't fix. And the guru died that day. That was in 99. And I've been a full-time student and a part-time teacher ever since. Nothing more, nothing less. So I want to talk first about what's the point of all this? Why all this change? Why are we pushing for change in the hoof care industry? And you might be surprised. It really has precious little to do with the feet. It has everything to do with the rest of the body. Just the most basic things. We say, okay, we like horses to be bare so the foot can function. If we protect the foot, we would rather protect it with boots instead of steel. And this seems like a really fruity thing to a lot of people. But think about it. When I walk into a place to teach, the first thing I do is look at the floor. If I'm going to be standing teaching on concrete, I know that my back and my body will be killing me by the end of each day. If I'm going to be teaching on nice padded carpet, then I know that I'll be feeling good at the end of the day. You know, I knew this as a kid, as a teenager, before I had all these aches and pains that I have now. I knew that I grew up in the construction business, and I knew that in the first few days of a new house when we're working on the concrete slab that my back and my legs were going to kill me, and that once we got the walls up and got up on the next level and I was working on plywood, that those pains were going to go away. So you hear people talking about energy dissipation, shock absorption, proper biomechanics, and everybody just nods their head, yeah, and it goes right in one ear and out the other. But these things are crucial, they're critical, and I think they're behind just about every body issue and most injuries that horses get. So this whole thing is about hooves and fixing hoof problems. But please, you should have lights going on and be paying careful attention every time I tell you a way to increase energy dissipation or shock absorption or to make the biomechanics more correct. Because honestly, that's the biggest, that's the most important part of it to me. I guess I've stayed that way really because of what brought me into this to begin with. I was a farrier shoeing horses. I also ran a business here in the North Georgia mountains, taking tourists on trail rides, and running that type of business, renting out horses to people that didn't know anything about horses. I ended up with this whole herd of geriatric geldings. Almost all of them were over 20. I had 4 or 5 over 30. I had 2 over 40. And we worked these horses hard. The property, the ride that we went on was straight up, straight down. It was rocky. We made it as action-packed as we could. We had jumps set up. We had places we let the people canter. And so we're working these horses hard. And so hard we were grinding their horseshoes down to the thickness of a coin. In 4 weeks' time, I would have to reset shoes, not because the hoof overgrew, but because I had worn the shoe completely out. So since we had all these old horses and we were working them so hard, along with that came a lot of things that I thought was perfectly normal. All kinds of aches and body issues. We had 4 or 5 horses on injured reserve at any given time, and we would just rest them until they felt better and put them back to work. I had horses that I knew could go on 2 trail rides in a day, 2 one-hour trips, but if I tried a third, their hocks would bother them, or their hip or their back. Some of their old problems would flare up, and so that we would just send them on 2 trail rides a day, and that was it. And good, bad, or indifferent, that's the way I did it. So meanwhile, there was a lot of you have probably heard of Cindy Sullivan. She has the Tribe Equus website. Was one of the first and biggest and most important barefoot websites that got this whole revolution started. Well, she lives 8 miles from me, and her daughter was a guide at my riding facility, and so Cindy was dropping her off, picking her up every day. And she started feeding me all this barefoot crap, stuff printed off the internet, the books, all the early works at the time. And of course I was all into hooves and I was reading it, and I was learning in spite of myself, but I didn't think it applied to me. Because I had tried. Not only, number one, again, I was wearing shoes to the thickness of a coin in less than a month. And on top of that, I was a bookworm as a farrier. I read, at this time I had read 8 or 10 farrier textbooks, and every one of them told me the same thing. They told me to avoid back-to-back-to-back shoeing. And they told me to, during the off season, to try to leave 5 to 6 months of barefoot time for the horse to go bare to let their feet recover from the shoeing. So I tried that. Well, what the books failed to do was teach me how to trim a foot so that it would improve while barefoot instead of falling apart. So that's the only thing I had seen. Wintertime would roll around, our business dropped to nothing, and so I'd pull the shoes off the horses and turn them out to pasture. Well, the feet would fall apart, and a month later I would have them all shot again. So now Cindy's coming along and trying to tell me I can take my horses barefoot. I thought she was off her rocker. But the more I read, the more I studied, I really started to see how much health benefit could be there. So finally, eventually, I gave it a try. Well, much to my surprise, the feet were just fine. The excess wear I was expecting didn't happen, and I wasn't even really using boots at the time. I can only imagine how great it had been if I had done that. But I got along fine. And the thing of it was, the feet were okay on the trail before in their shoes, and the feet were okay afterwards, bare. And honestly, I love to shoe so much. If I hadn't seen, if it had been just the feet, I probably would have gone back to shoeing just for fun. But it was the body's issues that blew me away. All these old horses, it suddenly woke them up. The horses that could only go on 2 trail rides a day suddenly could go on 6. My injured reserve list went to 0. I had to bone up on my training. I thought I was a horse trainer because all my horses would follow along each other on the trail, and all of a sudden our trail rides started to look like explosions of horses running around all over the place. But it brought and we had to relearn how to train horses, or I should say learn how to train horses to begin with. I didn't realize how much that I was robbing the spirit of those horses, and again, I think it has more to do with the bodies than with the feet. When I gave them their energy dissipation, then I freed them up and took so many aches and pains out of them that I had no idea was there. And so that's what got me, hook, line, and sinker right there, was what it did for those horses' bodies, and seeing what it does for body issues is what keeps me there now and keeps me trying to learn more constantly. I want to talk to you about the significance of the wild horses and what they mean to our work. There's so much that we've learned and so much yet to learn that's waiting there. These are the finest examples of equine flesh and spirit that I've ever seen. I have been teaching from following the works of others. I have been teaching about the significance of studying horses in nature for 10 years before Ivy and I made our first visit to wild horse country ourselves last March. And I'd been there for 2 minutes when I realized that even though I had seen a huge amount of significance there, that I still really didn't get it. These things were amazing. Just the body condition. We lucked into probably, it was the most rugged terrain I'd ever seen, just lava rocks everywhere. Now between each ridge, okay, there was soft ground and lush or green grass in between. You rarely even saw a track there. The horses stayed on these ridges, and that's where they spent all their time. They bedded down in these rocks. Yet their health was absolutely spectacular. Their movement, the way they could glide across the country, and just effortlessly, the movement, flexion, okay, everything that we dream of in our domestic horses. And it's so hard to capture in a still picture, but just the bending, flexion. There's a very critical moment in time that we very commonly see in our young horses. Have you ever watched a foal trotting by and said the words, "Wow, it looks like his feet aren't reaching the ground"? Okay, it's a very common thing for people to say. They're gliding along. It looks like they're floating above the ground. Okay, the reason why that comes across to us that way is that there is no moment of impact. There is no moment of breakover. Those are actually very unnatural things. When a horse is moving correctly, when everything's functioning correctly, the horse should extend, gradually start to load the back of the foot, and the horse rolls across the foot like a tire. Okay, there is no peak moment of impact. There is no specific moment of breakover. It's very fluid, and that's why you watch a foal very often and watch them move and feel like, and it looks to your eye like they're floating above the ground. But something very important happens in domestication. Okay, the horses were designed to live this very nomadic lifestyle in this sparse terrain. Most domestic horses I can hurt with thumb pressure at the back of the foot, and so If you what happens in domestication is very consistently is because the horses don't move enough and don't use their feet properly, is they start to get too heavy for the development of the back of the foot. The back of the foot starts to hurt, so they immediately move into an unnatural type of movement. They start to land on their toes. They start to avoid landing on the back of the foot, loading the toes. And that's the moment that we lose all the energy dissipating features of the back of the foot. We start to get this jarring impact. And that's the moment we stop saying that it looks like our foals are floating above the ground. So when we walked into wild horse country, suddenly we're faced with, we followed 60 horses around for 3 days from daylight till dark, and every one of them was moving like foals, and just floating above the ground. We never saw a horse give or gimp or limp on any of these rocks. But again, that was the small part of it. You forgot about their feet. But the amazing part was they're all gliding above the ground. They're all using their bodies and their feet correctly. So that really hit us in the face. So even then, in March 2005, as long as I'd already been teaching this stuff, that the relevance of how important it is really, really sunk in. So I want to spend some time looking at these wild hooves. These, a lot of you will recognize, these are Jamie Jackson's specimens. Jamie's study of these hooves were arguably the beginning of this natural hoof care movement. And there's a lot of things that we really learn from them and others. Some of it being that the frog and the bars, the frog and the heel bulbs are not two different things. Okay? That it's all one seamless unit. The heels are not lifting the frog off the ground. Okay? But we have the back of the foot, the heels, the bars, the frog, the bulbs that are all working in unison to absorb the initial impact energy. Another feature we really learned from studying these hooves that we'll talk a lot about is this Mustang roll and its shape. All right, one of the best things that I hope I can do for you is make you start to think of hoof motion, okay, instead of standing still. Now, most of us were taught to evaluate balance and everything about a hoof while they're standing square on concrete. Okay? But horses don't get hurt standing square on concrete. They're not asked to perform standing square on concrete. So why is that so relevant to the hooves? To me, it's not at all. Okay? We need to learn to think of hooves in motion. Okay? We also need to learn to think of hooves on the terrain that they live and work on. The shape of this Mustang roll brings up a very good point with how we need to consider the terrain and the movement. If you actually trim a foot this way, what most people will say when they first look at your trim is that, wow, you made the hoof wall passive. Yes, standing square on concrete, that natural roll does make the hoof passive. Okay? But let's look at the hoof in motion. The horse should extend, land on the back of the foot, and then as the horse completes stride, okay, coming to support phase, we're still not really using our toe walls. When we're actually using our toe walls is when the horse is pushing off. That Mustang roll sets it up perfectly to as the horse is pushing off that the hoof can work properly, and not just at the center of the toe, because horses do turn, they do go on uneven terrain. So we're looking at the same thing on the edges as the horse uses the foot. That this Mustang roll is not passive. Nothing on the bottom of the foot, nothing that casts a shadow is passive if you consider the terrain. So very important to think of them that way. But as we study these wild hooves, one thing we have to realize is that there is a variance in nature. We can't just walk up and say, okay, most of the wild hooves have this very low heel, so we're going to whack the heels off of every horse we come in contact with. Because in domestication and in nature we have variance. This was probably the oldest horse that we saw, but he's a herd stallion that still has that still has a herd. Okay, but look at this heel, almost as long as his toe. Okay, so we have to also recognize there is variance in nature. Okay, so we can't just use these wild hooves as another cookie cutter trim to cut all of our hooves that way. It doesn't work. Okay, looking further at this same cadaver of Jamie Jackson's, other features we want to talk about. One is this deeply concave sole. But I want to caution you, a lot of people have looked at these deeply concave soles of the wild horses and said, okay, we need to cut deeply concave soles on all of our domestic horses, because or thought that sole is lifted off the ground by this concavity. But again, that's not considering the terrain. This rocky, rough country that this foot was forged on is this sole is very much active, very much being used. Okay, so again, nothing is passive on the bottom of the foot. Another feature I want to talk about that we really learn to understand looking at these wild hooves is the straightness of wall growth. Okay, that's very important. This is one of the factors that we should use first thing to evaluate every hoof that we walk up to. I want to teach you to evaluate hooves, to look at your walls, always to look at the upper inch of growth. If you look at your horse, that tells us what the horse wants. That generally tells us what the horse has grown before we've had a chance to screw it up. Okay, so if you look at this upper inch of growth and can visualize what the horse is going to grow, what he wants to grow. If you then move your hand away and you don't get a big surprise, very likely you have this situation, that you have nice connected growth to the bone all the way down. Yeah, that's what we're after. If you walk up to your horse and look at this upper inch of growth, and you visualize what the horse wants, this is his foot that he wants to have, and you move your hand away and you get a surprise that the hoof deviates outward, then very likely you have this situation going on inside. That this upper growth is more parallel to the bone, and then this is peeling away. We'll talk a lot about that as we go. And this is a very quick, very accurate way that you can get an idea of how your hooves are attached. Another feature we've learned from studying these wild hooves is this arch. This should be from front to back. If we'll get into it a little deeper later, but for now, the front half of the hoof is supported by the coffin bone, the rear half of the foot by the lateral cartilages. So if we have our coffin bone here, lateral cartilages there, we have the flexion of the lateral cartilages so the horse can impact. On impact, this arch draws out flat and absorbs the energy. Okay, but then the front half of the foot is rigid, so it's available to push the horse off. So this arch and it being able to flex and function is very important to the horse's energy dissipation and hoof function. Ivy and I, when we were on our trip, we found this horse. It was the only man-made thing for miles. Was this cattle grade, and it claimed this mare. Judging her teeth, she was a teenage mare. We got her hooves. I want to look at them. They have a lot of similarities to what you may be used to seeing, and then some differences too I want to talk about. But remember, this was that same rocky country from the earlier pictures. These are the front feet. This beautiful back of the foot development. These are the hinds. It's gorgeous feet. Now I'll talk about some of the features of these hooves. One, notice these frogs bulging out like that. Okay, most of us were taught that we should always cut the frogs so that they're passive to the hoof walls. So it's led to routine trimming away of this material. Okay, so let's look at this and remember this rocky terrain the horse came from. If I cut this much of this frog off and got it between the heels, would it be passive in that rocky terrain? No, it would just be thinner, weaker, more sensitive. Okay, so we have to consider the terrain. Another thing, this horse had the sole sticking up slightly longer than the hoof walls. Most of us were taught that we should cut that sole down, get it 1/16 of an inch lower than the hoof wall so that it's passive. Okay? And we took this and we believed it. Took it in one ear and out the other without ever stopping and thinking about the terrain. Now if I cut this sole down so that it's below the hoof wall, is it going to be passive in that rocky terrain? No, it's just going to be thinner, weaker, more sensitive. Okay, so that's the part, and I can't stress enough that when we evaluate a hoof, we have to consider the terrain. We have to consider the use, the movement. Okay, but in these hooves we saw the same arch front to back, the same low heel, general shortness of the hoof capsule, straight growth. This was a white hind foot, very beautiful as well. And here you can see again this sole slightly up above the hoof wall. Okay, so many of us taught to cut that down below the walls. All right, but the sole's going to be being used either way. We're going to get deeper into the way this is all put together in later DVDs. But right now for this discussion, we have to talk about this basic structure. And these are your dermal lamina. And this is an 1/8 of an inch thick layer of living tissue that's on the coffin bone in the front half of the foot and on the lateral cartilages in the back half of the foot. Okay, and then attached underneath to the coffin bone and the lateral cartilages is our sole and our sole corium. Okay, attached to the outside, the hoof walls. Most people, if we look inside the hooves, and this is another one of Jamie Jackson's wild cadavers, if we look inside the hooves, we see the coffin bone and cross section. That's what so many people, even professionals, think of the hooves as this little pointy thing, or think of the coffin bone as this little pointy thing sticking down into the hoof capsule. But meet the coffin bone. Okay, it only looks like that little pointy shape in cross section. If you look at the entire coffin bone, you'll see that it's basically shaped like a miniature hoof, or the front part of the hoof. The lateral cartilages, they're attached, they extend from there, and they're the foundation for the back of the foot, just like the coffin bone's the foundation, the front half of the foot. The coffin bone is concaved underneath, and the sole attached to it becomes concaved as well if it's of adequate thickness. So if we look at this hoof that has the lateral cartilages and the lamina and the solar corium removed, and compare it to this hoof, which still has them in place. In this, our coffin bone would end right here, and our lateral cartilages extend on beyond, and again, this same 1/8 of an inch layer of living tissue on top of all that. Now, very important that you understand this structure. It will become very important to your trimming. So these wild hooves are our absolute most important model. Okay, they should be always in mind when we trim a hoof. It should always be our goal that we're working towards. But with this has to come a great degree of caution. Okay, and a lot of people have tried it, a lot of people have taught it, but you cannot just cut most domestic horse hooves down to these parameters. Let's take this hoof for example. This hoof is 2.5 inches long from cornet to the toe. So does that mean to put a natural hoof on a horse, we should walk up to every horse we trim and cut a 2.5-inch toe on it? No, we cannot. Okay, the reason is this. Look at the relationship of the hoof wall to the height of the coffin bone. In this hoof, the coffin bone is actually sticking up higher than the hoof wall itself. So many of our domestic hooves are in this situation. The coffin bone literally dropped through the hoof capsule. So you walk up to a hoof like this and cut it to natural parameters, and you'll wound the horse severely. So why do our horses get this way? We'll get into a lot of these reasons later, but basically we tend to feed our horses carbohydrate-rich diets that weaken the attachment of hoof to horse. We tend to let the hooves overgrow and lift the sole and the frog off the ground and take away the natural support from underneath. Over time, so many of our domestic horses, to some extent or another, the coffin bone just sinks lower in the hoof capsule, and so that really the last place that we should measure from when considering hoof length is from the coronet. It's very dynamic and mobile. Okay, we should look at this in terms, and this is a hoof that I've peeled the hide off of. Peeled the coronet away, taken away the hoof wall, the sole, and we're just down to these internal structures. All right? This is what our eye has to see every time we look at and evaluate a hoof, and I'm going to teach you how to find this true foot inside the horse. Okay, and we have to understand the shape of the internal structures before we can even begin to do correct trimming on the hooves. Okay, so if we visualize the front line need is to have an adequate sole covering the internal structures and padding them from the ground, and this is our foundation that we expect to look for and have. The coronet can distort upward and dramatically affect our wall length measurements. So, and it's how you want to look at it. If you want to look at it that the coffin bone is dropping down through the hoof capsule, or if you want to look at it that the coronet is being distorted upward. And it's just the semantics, it's how you look at it. Either way, measuring wall lengths is not our number one priority. Our number one priority is going to be ensuring that there's adequate sole depth underneath their living tissue. If you look at these wild hooves and they look strange to you at first, as they certainly did me the first time I saw them, it's probably been because you've been looking at very unnatural hooves. And this is very common. So much in the world, you go around, you'll see hooves that when compared to the hooves that we see succeeding in nature, light years away from it. And hopefully you're starting to see, our angles jacked up too steep. Okay, the landing zone of the horse, this soft, flexible back of the foot that's supposed to dissipate their energy, jacked up off the ground by excessive heel heights. It's this exact setup is so common in our horses. The landing zone lifted off the ground and rendered inactive completely. Okay, our angles jacked up too steep. These metal horseshoes are the least of this lady's problems. Now the difference though is this. While yes, we have people do this to themselves, you go to a human athletic event and you won't see this anywhere. Not even in the spectators. You go to an equine athletic event and you'll see this, and you'll see the exact same setup almost everywhere you look. Now, if a human athlete tried to compete this way and she strained a tendon or hurt her knee or threw out her back, we would all say, no wonder. Okay, what did you expect? Okay? But when an equine athlete is expected to perform in the exact same setup and they get a knee problem, they get a back problem, it just seems that nobody even recognizes that this could be a slight factor. So this to me is the reason why understanding these natural hooves, that please understand we're not going to cut every hoof to this form, but we have to have a direction. We have to have a goal. We have to have a place that we're always working towards, towards what is natural and what is correct. Before we get into the trimming, I really need to talk about boots. Most of what I've learned over the years, I've learned from making mistakes. And with hoof boots, I think that they represent one of my most critical errors going into this. I've used boots ever since I stopped putting shoes on horses, but I always looked at them as something to fall back on. I wanted to do it barefoot, and so if things weren't going well, if a horse was really lame, or if the horse owner wasn't getting the riding done they wanted to, then 4 months later I would sheepishly start talking about the boots. And when that would happen, I felt defeated, the horse owner felt defeated, and it was just a bad deal. But at some point, I just switched gears completely. I realized that the boots are a part of this deal. I mean, an absolute part. I think that there will always have a need to protect horses' feet. We can never trim well enough or condition well enough that we could just say, okay, hoof protection is obsolete. And that time's not going to come. We'll always need to vary traction if a horse is competing on one terrain and living on another type of terrain. There's always going to be a need for us to put something on horses' feet, just like we have a need to put things on our feet. Okay? But what I'm against here is steel. Why nail a piece of steel onto a horse's foot so that an hour a week or 12 hours a week when you ride it, that it has that on there? It's the steel is not conducive to health. The shoeing books will tell you that. Now, I do the same thing. I go at corrective work on horses with corrective trimming. I use epoxies when I need to. Different sole packs. There's a wide array of things that I do for correction of problems. But what the only thing that's missing is the steel. And for the life of me, I can't think of an example where I would have to have it. I'll let you in on a little secret. I took my anvil out of my truck 7 years after I nailed on my last horseshoe. As I told myself when I first got into this that I wasn't going to sacrifice a horse's health for my ideals to try to be barefoot. I stood ready to nail a shoe on a horse anytime I needed to, but I didn't need to. And so it's the corrective trim that we do, and it's building. Yes, sometimes we need to build with epoxies when we need to, but nailing a horseshoe on is not something that we need to do. But we do need to protect, and we always will. So at some point I just changed immediately from using the boots when I had to bringing them in right off the bat. And that's just part of the deal. And as soon as I did, everything got better. I found that I could fix almost every pathology quicker to go ahead and let the owner go and ride in boots and the horse is moving correctly, and then you're developing your internal structures faster. The growth rate on a horse is controlled by impact. Every time the hoof hits the ground, it grows a little bit. So if the horse is standing around lame, you're gonna grow and develop your feet very slowly. If the horse owner's out having a blast on their horse in their boots and pads, then you're gonna move away from the boots much more quickly. So I hate the way I sound like a boot salesman these days, but honestly, the use of the boots will get you away from boots quicker. It'll get you away from the need for protection. So we want to do this fairly for the horses. And basically, at this point in the game, I will not pull a pair of horseshoes off a horse unless the owner gets boots. They will buy boots. I carry them in my truck, and it's a part of the deal. And if they don't need them at all and they're okay barefoot and they want to sell them back to me 3 months later, that's fine. I'm happy to buy them back. I'll sell them to somebody else. So using the boots up front takes the fruitiness out of this. I'll tell you a little story that really illustrates this. About 1.5 years ago, I got called on a foundered horse by a local vet, and went up there to work on the horse, and it needed the diet worked on. It needed the sugars out of the diet, and it had long flared hoof walls, and just the ripping and tearing was causing most of the pain for the horse. And I trimmed the horse, and it moved off very comfortably after the trim. Well, normally if it hadn't, I would have set him up with the pads and boots and everything. But since the horse was happy barefoot, I didn't bring it up. So they didn't know anything about me. They didn't know that I was known for getting horses out of shoes or anything like that. They just knew I was the farrier the vet recommended when their horse foundered. So I go back up 4 weeks later to do my maintenance trim, and the lady was at work, and she sent her grandfather there. And the grandfather, he's 80-something years old, and he farmed his whole life, mostly with horses and mules, and to a point that they even hauled their wares back and forth to town in wagons. They spent a whole life with horses, and of course most of it in horseshoes. And so I'm there, I'm working on the foot, and he's up there holding the horse and just making conversation with me, and he says, "So, do you shoe many horses around here?" And I said, and I'm working, I said, "Well, yes, sir, I shoe a lot." And I said, well, I didn't want to talk to the guy. I was busy, I had a lot to do, but I couldn't leave it at that. So I went and I pulled a boot out of the truck, and I showed it to him and showed him how it worked, and said, I do it a little differently than what you might think. He said, I said, I just go around and keep the horse's feet trimmed up and on a routine schedule, and they've got these newfangled shoes now that we put on the horses, and so the horse is just bare, and I keep it trimmed, and then when the people go somewhere rocky, they put on these boots. And he goes, wow, what do they think of next? I was done, so I go back to work, and I'm working, and I'm done talking. Well, he's up there quiet, and he's holding this horse, and he's thinking. And 5 minutes went by, and he says, "You know what?" He says, I bet you if you kept him trimmed up good and didn't ever put a shoe on him, I bet he wouldn't need those boots very much, would they? And I said, well, yes, sir, that's the way it usually turns out. Converted right on the spot after 70 years in the horse business. And 8 years ago, it would have taken me about 45 seconds to totally fall out with the man, okay? Because I would have told him that, you could have gotten 3 or 4 more years of life out of every horse you ever put down, and you were harming your horses, and all these bad things I would have had to say. But I'm a little smarter now, and really, it's like I say, what we're doing here is based in science and common sense. Okay, it's the people in it that make it fruity sometimes. So what we're doing, we're not about pulling the shoes off horses and having them hobbling around. We have these tools to fall back on. And I think, and I'll show you some of these boot models, just a year ago, 2 years ago, the boots that we had to work with were really poor, and but now we're creating enough of demand. Now smarter people are thinking about hoof boots. The market's getting large enough now that we're going to see our boots continuing to evolve. See. And I think even the boots that are on the market right now, they should be obsolete already. And I was so poor that I didn't have potatoes to go with my steak. I had $3,000 worth of shoes in my closet. I had a different foot. Sometimes I wear 3 or 4 different pairs of shoes in a day. You know, why does the hoof protection need to go from pasture to the show ring, to work, to exercise? What we need is a world that we have boots that are as good as our shoes, that we have football cleats for polo horses, that we have lightweight cross trainers for endurance horses. And so, you know, there's a lot of room, but we need, and we need to up the ante on our horses' hoof protection. So I'm going to talk to you about the boots that I use right now. And again, I promise you I'm not on their payroll, but this company, Easy Care, is listening to us. They've been continually evolving their boots based on what the professionals in the field are telling them. So right now, this boot, the Easy Boot Epic, is my personal favorite, and that's subject to change. Again, there's so much more we can do with boots than what's been done. But I'll show you the features I like about this. Well, actually, first let me tell you the story. These evolved from the old Easy Boot, and most of you will recognize this. It's been on the market for years. I never liked them too much, and they have these teeth inside here that dig into the hoof, and they have to be so tight because they clamp down and this strap goes around the back. And you know, any horse, even if he doesn't particularly forage, is going to step on himself occasionally. So to keep the boot on when a horse occasionally steps on himself, they had to be so tight and have these teeth in it, and they made them very problematic for most horse owners unless they were really skilled at working under the horse and playing around with the boot fit. So I never really was a big fan of the old Easy Boot. So the president of Easy Care came and spoke at our association conference in 2004 and said that he had designed the perfect boot, that it was all the rigid parts were below the hairline, so there was no chance of rubbing, and they stayed on, and it was lighter than anything else on the market. And you know, we're all excited about it. And so when he comes in there and he holds up this. And I'm like, you know, that's not anything new. You just put a soft gator thing up on top of the old Easy Boot. But luckily, he gave us some to try, and I fell head over heels in love with them. And the reason why is this. With this soft gator present, when the horse does step on himself, then it doesn't pull the boot off. So that eliminated the need for the teeth. It eliminated the need for the thing to be so tight, and what we were left with was a low-profile, lightweight boot that really performs well. So right now, today, these are my favorites. They've made some. First, let me talk about the modifications I'll make. So on the models that have the teeth inside, I'll always take a pair of pliers and squash them flat. Really never use the teeth. There's no need for it. This rubber strap, if it rubs on the hairline, it'll cause a horrendous rub. So you want to be sure that it never touches the hairline of the horse. If you have a very low-heeled horse and it is touching it, I'll just take a heavy pair of shears and trim it down. Another problem that we found is that's a modification we can make is a rock will a lot of times hit this buckle and throw it open. So, and there's a hole right here. Endurance riders like to stick a cotter pin through that hole so it can happen, so it can't flip up. And incidentally, the reigning current endurance champion rode every mile, 2,500 miles in these boots this past year. So, but anyway, what I found is that if I take a grinder and I'll grind this buckle down to a long point, that it really doesn't happen for most trail riders, that nothing will hit that and push it up if you grind that down. For people that cross creeks and ride in through water, I'll take and drill large. I'll drill a 1/2 inch hole right there at the place that the boot is filled anyway, and right there in the center of the foot. And it's not something you have to do, but I hate to hear water sloshing in a boot. I want in 2 steps for the water to all be gone. So these large 1/2 inch holes. Some people worry about sand and grit getting up in there, and I've never seen a horse get something in there that caused any problem. So if you think about this, the overall notion of using boots, that it turns what we're doing here into really what the farrier textbooks always told us to do. They always told us to let the foot be bare whenever possible, the shoe when necessary. So now we have something that we can let the horse be barefoot most of the time, and then put the shoe on specifically for the ride. And then we can even customize, the horse owner, even different times throughout the day, can customize the tread. The standard tread works good on most surfaces. This same company makes a concave type of a pattern. Works very well, self-cleaning, quickly cleans. It gets excellent traction in arena sand and most arena footings. They also make this is they call the grip. It gets tremendous traction in muddy conditions. And then we've done a bunch of clinics in Norway, and the Norwegians love these boots and actually what they'll usually do is take the standard tread pattern when they're working on ice and fasten bolts. You can go to, now different companies make different ice screws and everything to add to the boots, but what the Norwegians seemed to like the most was actually just taking $3 or $4 to the hardware store, and you can buy little threaded washers at any hardware store and a hex bolt, and you come on the 4 corners and put a 1/2 inch hex bolt, and they said that was more durable and got better traction on ice than any of the commercial ice screws, and also translated well to stepping on ice and then stepping onto pavement and back onto ice and all that, which will destroy most of the commercial ice screws. So, your own imagination's the limit. If you prefer the traction of a horseshoe, bolt a horseshoe on there, but at least still you have something that's going to last you for months or years instead of lasting for a 5 or 6 week trimming cycle, and then the horse isn't wearing it all the time. So just a healthier and better protection all the way around. If a horse has thin soles, it's amazing how great it feels to put a padded insole in there. We used to use saddle pads, neoprene, any kind of foam that we could find, and then thankfully this company started turning out a line of different pads for us, and this is from the same company, Easy Care. I'm serious, I'm not on their payroll. They just make my life easier, very good for horses. So, but anyway, this pad works very well. From there, we found that often navicular horses or horses with skinny, weak, contracted frogs needed extra. So I would take and fill that area area with foam. We did some articles on that. They're on our website. They listened again and started creating this a whole line of pads that you buy and use, and you've got different, every color, the green, red, black is a different density, and then you've got different heights to your frogs, and you can go in and interchange, or take a horse that has a prolapse frog and use it this way so that you're reducing the pressure on the frog. You can put in one the same height and make a flat pad out of it, or exaggerate the pressure on the frog. So these work very well, and almost always, if it's a foot problem, you can play around with the different densities and thicknesses and find the combination that'll make the foot feel right. And then if that changes the next day, then you can change it the next day, and you're not stuck in one support decision that has to last you for the next 6 weeks. So the whole deal is just win-win-win to me. Now, the boots are designed just for riding. They're not designed to be on a horse 24 hours a day. So the horse is perfectly capable of ripping them to shreds with their teeth. It doesn't happen very often, but it could. I also want to look at these new buckles that are right here they've designed. And this was part of combating the problem of a rock flipping them up. They've also designed this newer buckle that folds up instead of down and keeps that so that it can't kick upward. Now, the boots are not designed for 24/7 turnout. They're designed for putting on when you ride and you leave your horse barefoot for turnout. So, but in the case that comes up that we have a horse, and basically it's usually your foundered horses. The foundered horse, a lot of times, if we can't get them comfortable in the pasture where they're trimming, then we're going to automatically go to a boot turnout. So there's some things that you have to understand. Number one, fit becomes even more critical. You have to have a good fit. If the boot can move around on the horse, it'll rub. Okay. Secondly, it gets inside the boot gets really nasty and funky. And it's no different than in a pad under a horseshoe, but I never liked that either. So I always recommend that people pull the boots off every day, clean, sanitize, and then let the horse dry out for an hour, and then put them back on. With the epics, they work very well for turnout. If the horse does chew on the boot, then we put hot sauce on the boot and doesn't do that anymore. You can minimize the stink and keep it cleaner inside by putting Gold Bond medicated powder. You can get at the drugstore. It's for humans. Put that on the horse. But the one problem I found with turnout on the epics is if you turn out for a month or so and it's staying on there, it gets wet inside and it'll make the hair on the back of the foot slip. And it's not even like a rub. It's like it just gets wet and lets go. So now granted, we're always talking about saving the life of a foundered horse when we're doing that. So the hair slipping may not seem like a huge deal, but it's bad form. So I've moved more and more towards back to the boot that I used to put down so much is the old original easy boot, because the foundered horses or a lame horse you're turning out in boots, they generally don't forge. They don't step on themselves. They're doing that when they're doing heavy activity. So you put these on there and you can still fit them loose like we fit the epics, and they tend to stay on very well. So not all horses. Some horses you need the epic with the gaiter on there, but more and more I'm finding that most lame horses, most foundered horses that we're needing to protect for 24/7 turnout, that we just go ahead and use the old school easy boot, and I'm seeing really good results with doing that. No matter what the brand of boots you use, and these and many of the other brands on there, the difference between success and failure is in the fit. And one of the things that that has given hoof boots in general a bad name is the fact that if a horse owner that knows nothing about feet, that knows nothing about boots, orders a pair of boots off the internet or out of a magazine, they're just a little bit more likely to succeed than if they ordered a keg horseshoe off the internet or out of a magazine. Okay? You have to know how to get them fit correctly. So once they're fit correctly, then it just adds 10 seconds to the tacking up process to throw them on. Okay, so it's very important we get them fit right. And that's one of the reasons I really stress the only competent way to do natural hoof care professionally is you carry a full stock of these things in your truck and you provide them. I don't even ask my customers if they want boots or not. If the horse needs boots, I fit the horse in boots, put it on the bill, and believe it or not, nobody questions it. It's when the professional is acting like it's optional that people start thinking it's optional. But this needs to be part of the deal. So if the professional's there that understands boots and understands the hoofs and understands the terrain the horse is going to work on, does a professional fitting job, and then as the foot changes, you need to constantly check that fitting job. Then we'll have problem-free use for the horse owners. Now, if you're a horse owner off on your own and watching this and don't know how to fit boots, I'm going to run this down with you a little bit. The number one thing is the boot cannot shift and turn around the foot. If the boot's too big and wiggles around, it'll rub. Okay? If the boot's too small, and the heels won't go all the way down into it and they're cocked up on the back, it'll rub. Okay, so you have to make sure you get the right fit. So if you order a boot and it's the wrong size and it's sloshy on your foot, then don't use it anyway. You won't be happy with it. If you're in between sizes, a lot of times with most boot brands, you can put an insole in there and succeed well with that. I like to use, you can go to a leather shop and get heavy leather, about 1/4 of an inch thick and up to 3/8 of an inch thick, and I like to cut insoles for the boots. Okay, I don't like to use the foam pads to insole for fit because that locks my customers into having to have a brand new pad for the boot to fit. So what I like to do is fit the boot without a pad and then put the pad in and see if I can get the foot on, get the boot on correctly with the pad in. When I do need an insole to correct a fit, I want to use something that's not going to go away. And so that's where I'll use the leather for that. Watch very carefully. Again, I already mentioned we have to make sure the back strap isn't touching the horse. Trim it off the hairline if it is. Make sure that the tongue isn't touching the cornet. Trim it off if it is. And then look and make sure none of this upper part of the boot is touching the cornet. It's pretty rare, but occasionally, most of the time, I remove these covers and then take a pair of heavy pliers and squash the teeth flat, and then take a file and smooth any rough edges down. And on most horses, that works very well. But occasionally, if you get a horse that see these brass screws, on a very, very short-footed horse, sometimes those brass screws will touch the cornet. And watch, if they're touching the cornet, then I'll leave the covers in place and then take pliers. I'll still squash the teeth through that cover, but I'll leave the cover in place and it builds the hoof up just enough so that screw doesn't touch the cornet. So one other modification that I'll very routinely make is I'll pull this breakover back on almost every boot I fit. This little bevel on the front is just right for moving forward. But what about when the horse turns or goes on uneven terrain? So I'll take my rasp. Usually I'll do this on the horse and rasp a tremendous Mustang roll all the way around the front. Just be sure you don't go past that little seam right there. Now do that very routinely. It's amazing how much it makes the horses move better. And then occasionally on a foundered foot, that we'll talk about when the hoof wall is severely disconnected, we may need to pull breakover back, and I'll cut a more exaggerated breakover. Now when you do this, it does shorten the life of the boot, but again we're talking about saving the life of a dead horse. So it's worth it to go ahead and sacrifice the boot life, and I'll pull the breakover way back on the boot itself, and it can make a tremendous difference for the horse. These pads are padding system, or you don't have to use these. You can take different densities of foam, different thicknesses, and what we'll do is just cut a frog-shaped pad and put it in place over the frog, put a piece of duct tape, and then stick the foot down the boot. It's absolutely amazing how much, particularly when we talk later about navicular horses, using frog pads is magical for a navicular horse and magical for developing the back of the foot and developing the frogs and causing more growth and development. But a lot of the horses we'll run into that have a weak back of the foot, weak, sensitive, thrushy frogs, they may not have had a good, honest frog impact in years. And what'll happen is you pad the frog, and on the second step they'll stride out and they'll extend and use the back of the foot like they haven't done like they haven't done in years. And then the next day they may come up really sore from that. All right, don't be discouraged if that happens. Very commonly we have to play around and use different densities. So a horse may like a thick, hard pad one day and like a soft pad or even a flat pad the next day. Play with this. A lot of times you can take a horse that nobody's been able to use for years and get usability and develop the back of the foot. Even though it's not muscle, you need to look at it like you were developing a muscle. If you have been laid up and hospitalized for the last 6 months, all your muscles would atrophy to nothing. And when you get up and start working those muscles again, you're going to have soreness. So you got two alternatives. You can either go ahead and exercise them and redevelop them, or you can lay on the couch for the rest of your life and you can avoid that pain. So you look at it that way. Now, also, just like you were trying to recover from being bedridden, if you suddenly put on the Rocky music one day and work out for 3 hours and then you're so sore that you can't exercise again for 2 months, that's not going to do you any good either. So what you want to do is do just the exercise you can without getting sore, and then gradually increase it. Okay, developing the back of the foot is the exact same way. That we want to play with it and play with the amount of frog pressure we have and increase it gradually over time. If we go too far, we make the horse tender-footed. Just apologize and then back off a little bit next time, and so that we're gradually working this material. And very often, when you're rehabilitating a navicular horse, you'll have this to go through. And what I do, I give my customers a whole handful of different densities and thicknesses of frogs and frog pads, and then let them play with it that way as they're starting to rehabilitate and work the horse. Other than that, what I've got to say is use them. If somebody says they're following what I do and they have a horse out there limping around with no shoes on its feet, then they completely miss the point of what I'm about. What I'm about is getting away from steel permanently attached to the horse's foot. But I'm very much also about protecting the horse when they need it and giving them the type of protection, the type of traction that they need for a given situation their hoof is in and on a given terrain that they're asked to perform on.